In today's video, I would like to discuss something that really is not considered enough in UX design, and that is how a design wears over time. At the beginning of my career, I actually worked mostly in the cellular industry, specifically on cell phones, and something that was really important was not just how the cell phone behaved the minute that you bought it in the store, but also, the fact is you were going to be using this phone for hundreds of hours, and so how it wore over time and how its usability would go after the 50th hour and at the 100th hour was really critical in some of the design thinking that we used. So I'd like to extend some of that to designs that we use today. So I'd like to introduce a concept which is a usability time curve. And so right here what we have is on the x-axis we have time, so time as it goes on, and on the y-axis we have usability. Now this could really be any metric. I'm just talking about any measurement you want of usability. The idea is that the higher it is, the more usable it is. And again, on the bottom, the more time is on the right hand side. So now let's look at a standard usability curve. This is kind of what you would expect out of most user interfaces, where you've got usability at a certain level at the beginning, and then as time proceeds it gets more and more usable. But it does kind of reach a cap, and then here I've actually added an asymptote where it kind of reaches an ending point. Not all UI designs have an asymptote, but it's pretty common for them to sort of max out, because people get very comfortable with the UI and they stop learning new tricks, and then it's kind of static. So this is a very normal usability curve. This is kind of what you expect. But let's look at some curves that aren't what you expect. So here's one, and this is kind of my favorite because this really ties back to the cell phone. So the usability at the beginning in this one actually is not all that great, but over time it gets considerably better, and by the end it does reach an asymptote, but it's got really high usability. So this is really totally different than the initial one we looked at, where it started out with pretty good usability. It raised a little bit, but not much. And this one, it actually starts out a little bit lousy, but then really increases. And now let's look at a really oddball curve, but this really does happen, actually, this one quite a bit, which is that it starts with fairly high usability, and then for the first little bit it increases fairly well, and then it begins to drop off. Okay, so why might it drop off? Well, the reason that it drops off, the reason that it increases in the first place is people just get used to it and more comfortable. So you would expect pretty much every design you're going to get a little bump at the beginning, where people's first impressions, they begin to understand it and then it improves. But in this case, the reason that it decreases, and that it can decrease, is that once you begin to use the software over and over and over again, you begin to know it, and you begin to not necessarily need to use all of the scaffolding that's been provided for you. And by that I mean the explicit wording or wizards or buttons and things. Often you learn like how to use the software in the optimal way, and it's not necessarily the way that that you use it the very first time that you design for it. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this at the end. So let's look now at all three of these curves. Okay, so we have the first curve, and this is kind of the normal one that you kind of expect just intuitively. Here's that one that I talked about related to something increasing quite a bit over time, the usability increasing quite a bit over time. And then here's that oddball one where it goes up and then it goes down. Now the thing that I really want to point out here is not that any one of these in particular is better, because actually that doesn't really mean anything. It's more that we tend to focus on this first set of points, right? What happens at the very first moment. And why is that? That's because we rely heavily on usability and we're testing, and we rely heavily on people's impressions. But people's impressions are really their first impressions, and typically a usability test is only recording your first impression or your first interaction with a set of functionality, not all of it. So this is a real trap that we fall into, and to restate what I said at the beginning, I don't think this is really properly considered in our industry. We really spend a lot of time focused on how something's going to perform in a usability study, but what that means is how it performs the first time a user interacts with it. And sometimes that's appropriate, and sometimes it's not. So having looked at these curves, what are some of the lessons? So one is that your usability study should probably include time as a factor. That's not necessarily the case. If you're a website that's doing one-time purchases or just two-time purchases, then maybe time really isn't a factor. There are certainly use cases where time isn't really that important. But if time is important, then most likely your usability study today does not include time as a factor, and that's actually a major methodological weakness, and it doesn't really tell you how good the design is. The other obvious lesson that I've kind of been talking about is that you should design for usability over time and not one-time intuitiveness. And actually this will segue just into the next point, which is use highly directive design patterns with caution. And the one that I want to single out that we use all the time is the wizard. Now, it's not that the wizard per se is bad. It's that the wizard is actually highly directive. It tells you exactly what you need to do when you need to do it, but it's also very, very inflexible. So, you need to fill things out in a certain order, and if there's required fields, you need to fill in those required fields first. And this is a perfect example of that third curve that we looked at, where the usability increases at the beginning and then plummets. Because if you're using the software over and over and over again, or the product over and over and over again, and it's just a wizard, then eventually you're going to want to do things in your own way and not be directed by this wizard. So the wizard is just one example of something that's highly directive. And in general, we tend to want to put wording in the UI to explain how to do something, or we have multiple buttons. A common heuristic is, provide multiple exits. But the more things you put in something to make it more intuitive and more obvious, the more cluttered the screen gets, and the more that decreases the design over time. So anyway, I hope you've learned a lot from this video. By all means, reach out to me if you have any questions. Again, the main message is that we really tend to focus way too much on the initial experience, which really has to do with intuitiveness, and we don't focus nearly as much on the lifetime of the product, and that can account for websites, web apps, cell phones, you name it.